My name is Renee Henderson. I am 32 years old. 3 days ago, I was standing in a freezing emergency room in Tampa, watching a heart monitor trace the erratic pulse of an 82-year-old man. I held a crumpled yellow sticky note in my hand. It was the only thing my parents left behind when they boarded a first-class flight to Hawaii with my younger sister. The note said, "Courtney deserves a real vacation. You stay and handle Grandpa." They left him alone in a sweltering house with an empty refrigerator and a bottle of pills they swore were just his daily vitamins. They left him to quietly fade away so they could sell his property. What they did not expect was for me to pour those pills down the drain, or for him to wake up and tell me exactly what they had been doing to him for 2 years. Before I tell you how a neglected grandfather and an overlooked daughter stripped my parents of everything they valued, please hit the like button and subscribe to Intimately Told Stories. Only do it if this story resonates with you. I would also love to know your age and where you are watching from today. Drop it in the comments. Now, let me take you back to where this nightmare started. It was December 15th. The Florida heat was thick enough to wear as I unlocked the front door of my grandfather Theodore's house. The air conditioning was switched off. The silence inside felt heavy, suffocating. I walked straight to the kitchen. The refrigerator held nothing but a half-empty jar of mustard and a single bottle of expired orange juice. On the counter, taped to a plastic pill organizer, was that yellow sticky note. The ink was barely dry. My father, David, and my mother, Pamela, had slipped out before dawn. I walked into the living room and found Theodore slumped in his worn fabric recliner. His chin rested on his chest. His breathing was shallow. For 2 years, David and Pamela had barred me from visiting him alone. They claimed my presence agitated his severe dementia. They insisted he needed their constant, specialized care. I knelt beside his chair and touched his frail hand. His skin felt pale and damp. "Grandpa?" I whispered. His eyelids fluttered, but his gaze drifted past me, unfocused and hollow. I walked back toward the kitchen counter, my eyes locking onto the pill organizer. The handwritten label on the side read, "Daily Vitamins." I picked up the plastic container. The pills inside were not vitamins. I recognized the distinct shape and scoring of a heavy prescription sedative, the kind you give someone when you want them to remain compliant and silent. My stomach twisted into a tight, cold knot. They had not been managing his dementia. They had been manufacturing it. My hands shook as I carried the bottle to the kitchen sink, unscrewed the cap, and watched the capsules disappear down the drain. I pulled out my phone and ordered a week worth of groceries. My parents thought they had trapped me here to babysit a dying man while they sipped cocktails on a beach. They had no idea they had just handed me the keys to ruin their entire plan. The next 48 hours dragged by in a haze of stale coffee and relentless anxiety. I sat at the oak dining table with my laptop open, trying to balance digital marketing campaigns for my clients while monitoring the frail man in the recliner. The withdrawal from the sedatives was a grueling process. Theodore sweat through his cotton shirts, his breathing ragged and uneven in the stifling Florida heat. I kept the air conditioning running low, wiping his brow with damp cloths. His hands trembled uncontrollably whenever I guided a glass of water to his lips. Every few hours he muttered fragmented sentences, his mind trapped somewhere between the chemical fog and reality. I barely slept. I listened to the hum of the refrigerator, replaying the cruelty of my parents' decision over and over in my head. My father, David, always needed to be the smartest person in the room, dictating every family gathering with arrogant certainty. My mother, Pamela, treated any inconvenience as a personal insult, complaining whenever a situation did not cater to her comfort. Taking care of an aging parent was never in their vocabulary. They viewed Theodore as a problem to be solved, not a human being to be loved. By the morning of the third day, the bright winter sun streamed through the plantation shutters, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. I was typing an email to a client, the rhythmic clack of the keyboard filling the quiet room, when I heard a dry throat clear from across the living space. I looked up. Theodore was sitting straight up in his chair. His posture had shifted entirely. The heavy slump was gone. The vacant stare that had defined him for 24 months had vanished, replaced by a sharp, piercing blue gaze that tracked my movements with perfect clarity. He did not look like a dementia patient anymore. He looked like a man waking up from a long, forced slumber. "Renee," he said. His voice was raspy, dry as sandpaper, but the cadence was steady. "You look exhausted. Go make us some real breakfast, not that pureed oatmeal your mother forces down my throat. I want eggs. Over easy." I froze. My fingers hovered above the keyboard, the screen glaring back at me. "Grandpa?" I whispered, pushing my chair back and standing up slowly. "Do you know where you are? Do you know what day it is?" He let out a dry chuckle that sounded like crunching leaves underfoot. "It is Tuesday, December 18th. I am sitting in my own living room, and my greedy daughter and her pompous husband are currently sipping overpriced drinks on a beach in Maui, thinking they have finally gotten the old man out of the way." The air in the room grew thick. I pulled a chair close to his recliner and sat down, my heart pounding against my ribs. Over the next hour, he explained everything. The steep cognitive decline I had witnessed over the past 2 years was a carefully orchestrated illusion. David and Pamela had steadily increased the dosage of those sedatives, grinding the pills into his food, ensuring he remained too groggy to question their decisions. They isolated him from his friends. They told the extended family his mind was rapidly deteriorating. They created a false narrative of severe mental decline to justify taking total control over his life. "I sat trapped inside my own body," Theodore explained, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the armrests. "I could hear them talking in the kitchen. I could hear them planning my future." The anger radiating from him was palpable, a quiet storm brewing beneath his fragile frame. He told me about Sunset Pines. It was a notoriously underfunded state-run care facility on the outskirts of the county, a bleak place where residents were parked in hallways and forgotten. David had brought the glossy brochures home weeks ago. Theodore had listened, paralyzed by the drugs, as David and Pamela discussed moving him there the exact day they returned from Hawaii. Once he was locked away in a state ward, they planned to declare him legally incompetent, sell this Tampa house, and liquidate his entire estate to fund their lavish lifestyle. My mind raced to catch up with the sheer scale of the betrayal. "But Grandpa," I said, leaning forward and resting my elbows on my knees, "Dad holds your power of attorney. If they are that desperate to cash out, how has he not already drained your accounts? How did he afford a first-class trip to Hawaii without tipping his hand to the bank?" Theodore smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the sharp, calculating expression of a man who had spent 40 years negotiating ruthless corporate contracts. "David is arrogant," Theodore said, leaning back into his chair, "and arrogant men are remarkably easy to fool. When my health first started to slip a few years ago, I saw the greed shining in your father's eyes. I knew he would try to take control the moment I showed weakness. So I gave him exactly what he wanted, a kingdom to rule." Theodore explained his trap. He had deliberately created a decoy checking account. He funneled a portion of his monthly pension and Social Security into this primary account, making it look like his sole source of liquid wealth. He signed the power of attorney, granting David access to that specific account, letting my father believe he held the keys to the entire financial kingdom. "David has been siphoning money from that account for 2 years, Theodore said, a hint of dark satisfaction in his voice. "He thinks he is stealing my fortune dollar by dollar. He thinks he is outsmarting a senile old man. He has no idea the account he controls is nothing but a sandbox I built to keep him busy. My real assets are locked away where his power of attorney means nothing." The sheer brilliance of the decoy account left me speechless. This was not a man losing his faculties. This was a grandmaster playing chess while his opponents were stumbling through checkers. I spent the rest of the afternoon preparing a proper lunch, the smell of butter and frying eggs filling the kitchen for the first time in months. The suffocating tension in my shoulders began to ease. Later that afternoon, I was staring at a sprawling, chaotic spreadsheet on my laptop, trying to segment consumer data for a crucial holiday email campaign. The pivot tables were broken, and the formula kept returning red error codes across the screen. I sighed heavily, rubbing my temples, frustrated by the endless rows of mismatched numbers. Theodore walked up behind my chair, holding a fresh mug of tea. His steps were slow, but he did not shuffle anymore. "What is the bottleneck?" he asked, peering over my shoulder at the glowing screen. I shook my head, pointing at the monitor. "Just a logical error in the sorting sequence. The data tags are overlapping, and I cannot isolate the correct target demographic for the client." Theodore adjusted his glasses, squinting at the spreadsheet. He pointed a weathered finger at the screen. You are filtering the primary demographic before resolving the secondary variables. Reverse the sequence. Isolate the purchasing history first, then apply your geographic filters. The data will cascade correctly. I stared at him, then looked back at the screen. I clicked the mouse, adjusting the formulas exactly as he suggested. The spreadsheet refreshed, the red error codes vanished, and the data lined up in perfect, orderly columns. I looked up at him in genuine awe. He patted my shoulder gently. I managed logistics for international freight companies before you were born, Renee. Data is just cargo. You just have to know which boxes to unpack first. It was a small, quiet moment, but it shattered any lingering doubt in my mind. The brilliant, sharp-witted man who had taught me long division at the kitchen table was still here. He had just been trapped in a chemical prison built by his own family. We sat in companionable silence. The dynamic between us forever changed. We were no longer caregiver and patient. We were allies preparing for a war. I knew we had to act quickly. My parents would be back in less than 2 weeks, and they would be bringing the admission papers for Sunset Pines. We needed a plan to strip David of his remaining power and protect Theodore permanently. Just as I opened my mouth to ask what our next move should be, my phone vibrated loudly against the wooden table. The screen lit up with a notification, breaking the silence in the room. It was an alert from Instagram. My sister Courtney had just tagged me in a new post. I picked up the device, my heart rate spiking as I unlocked the screen. The image loaded, and the true audacity of my family stared back at me, ready to ignite a new battle. The notification illuminated my screen with a bright, cheerful glow that felt entirely out of place in that quiet house. I swiped the notification, opening the app. A photograph of my sister Courtney stared back at me. She was sitting in a private cabana overlooking the Pacific Ocean, holding a cocktail served inside a hollowed-out pineapple. A platter of seared ahi tuna and Wagyu beef rested on the teak table in front of her. The location tag proudly declared an exclusive Maui resort where dinner reservations cost more than a typical car payment. The caption read, "Island breezes and zero stress, much-needed sister retreat." Below the photo, a direct message chimed in from her. The text read, "Hey Ren, the breeze here is ruining my hair, but the food is divine. Do not forget to swing by my apartment and feed Sir Paws. His organic wet food is in the second pantry drawer. Make sure you stir it well." Courtney was 26, a self-proclaimed lifestyle influencer whose primary talent consisted of spending other people's money. Growing up, my parents shielded her from every consequence, praising her average achievements while treating my college scholarships as a basic expectation. She lived in a luxury downtown loft, drove a leased European sedan, and never once asked how Theodore was doing. I stared at the message, feeling a cold wave of disgust wash over me. She did not ask about our grandfather. She only cared about her pampered cat and her expensive organic cat food. I locked my phone and slid it face down on the table. Sir Paws could wait. I had a financial trail to uncover. I left Theodore resting in his chair and walked down the hallway to the guest room my father repurposed into a home office. David always needed a dedicated space to project his authority, even in a house he did not own. The room smelled of his expensive, overly musky cologne. A heavy mahogany desk sat in the center, cluttered with unopened mail and manila folders. If Theodore was telling the truth about the dummy account, the evidence of my father's theft had to be buried in this paperwork. I began sifting through the stacks, sorting the junk mail from the official bank correspondence. It did not take long to find the discrepancies. Tucked beneath a pile of golf magazines, I discovered a thick stack of envelopes bearing the official seal of the Hillsborough County tax collector. The paper felt heavy, ominous. I opened the top envelope. The bold red letters across the top read, "Final Notice of Delinquency." My father, the man who prided himself on his impeccable financial image, had not paid the property taxes on Theodore's house in over 2 years. The accumulated debt, including penalties and interest, was staggering. David was quietly draining the dummy checking account to fund first-class flights and island resorts, while allowing the very roof over his father-in-law's head to edge closer to foreclosure. I gathered the tax notices, my hands gripping the paper tight enough to crease the edges. I marched back into the living room and laid the final notices on the table in front of Theodore. He looked down at the red ink, then up at me. I expected him to show shock, perhaps fear over losing his home. Instead, the corners of his mouth curled upward into a slow, calculating smirk. "Let him skip the taxes," Theodore said, his voice carrying a dry, raspy amusement. "Let him build his little house of cards. It is all going to burn down soon anyway." I shook my head, trying to process his calm reaction. "Grandpa, if the county forecloses on this property, you will have nowhere to live. They will use this as an excuse to throw you into Sunset Pines tomorrow." Theodore leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Renee, go out to the garage. Look on the very top shelf above the old workbench. Tucked behind the spare paint cans, you will find a green metal tackle box. Bring it to me." I frowned, confused by the sudden pivot, but turned and walked through the laundry room into the humid, dusty garage. The space was cluttered with forgotten holiday decorations and broken lawn equipment. I found a step stool, climbed up, and reached over a row of dried-out paint cans. My fingers brushed against cold, textured metal. I pulled the heavy object down. It was a vintage fishing tackle box, the dark green paint flaking off, the steel latch coated in a thick layer of orange rust. It looked like worthless junk, something destined for a yard sale bargain bin. I carried it back inside and set it on the dining table. The contrast between the rusted metal and the polished oak surface was striking. David was a man obsessed with appearances. He wore tailored suits, drove leased luxury vehicles, and refused to touch anything that did not shine with perceived wealth. He would never in a million years open a dirty, rusted box in a dusty garage. Theodore knew his son-in-law perfectly. He knew David's arrogance was his biggest blind spot. Theodore gestured toward the rusted latch. "Open it." I unclasped the metal hook. The hinges groaned as I lifted the lid. Inside, there were no fishing lures, no tangled lines, no bobbers. Instead, the compartments had been hollowed out to make room for a thick stack of pristine, legal-sized documents sealed inside a waterproof envelope. I carefully pulled the envelope out, unwinding the string closure. The first document was a certificate of formation for a limited liability company, stamped and dated over a decade ago, long before David and Pamela began treating Theodore like a nuisance. I scanned the pages, my eyes widening as the legal jargon painted a clear, undeniable picture. The LLC was wrapped inside an ironclad blind trust. David's generic power of attorney gave him zero jurisdiction over this entity. He could not access it, he could not sell it, and he did not even know it existed. I pulled out the next document. It was a commercial property deed. I read the address out loud, recognizing the prestigious zip code in downtown Orlando. Theodore nodded, a spark of quiet triumph in his blue eyes. "I bought that parcel of dirt 30 years ago, built a 3-story office plaza on it. Currently, it is fully leased to a rapidly expanding tech firm on a 10-year corporate contract." I found the most recent property appraisal tucked at the back of the stack. My breath hitched in my throat. The commercial plaza was valued at $4.2 million. The monthly lease revenue alone was enough to fund a luxury lifestyle multiple times over. "I kept the revenue funneling directly into the trust," Theodore explained, settling back into his chair. "I hid it because I wanted to see who would stand by me when the money dried up. I wanted to see who would love a fragile, broke old man. Your parents failed the test, Renee, but you stayed. You fought for me." He reached across the table and tapped the thick stack of papers. "I want to leave every single cent of this to you, but we have a severe problem." I looked up from the staggering appraisal value, the reality of the situation crashing over me. The blind trust protected the asset for now, but David still held that overarching power of attorney. If my father somehow discovered the existence of this Orlando property, he could use his legal authority to attempt a hostile liquidation before Theodore passed away. "We need to legally sever David's control," Theodore said, his voice hardening with urgency. "We need to rewrite the will and revoke that power of attorney. And we have to do it before your parents step off that return flight in exactly 10 days. The reality of $4.2 million sat on the dining room table, smelling of aged paper and rust. I stared at the pristine commercial deed, then looked at the calendar hanging on the kitchen wall. It was the week of Christmas. The humid Tampa air felt suffocating as the ticking clock echoed in my mind. My parents and my sister would step off their return flight in exactly 10 days. We had less than 240 hours to sever my father's ironclad power of attorney and draft a new will to protect my grandfather permanently. The legal race had officially begun. I opened my laptop and started searching for top-tier elder law attorneys in the area. I dialed the first number, tapping my fingernails against the oak table. A cheerful automated voice greeted me, announcing the firm was closed for the holiday season and would reopen in early January. I hung up and dialed the next firm, another voicemail. I tried a third, a fourth, and a fifth. Every single high-profile legal office in the county had shuttered their doors for winter break. Panic began to tighten my chest. Time was our most valuable currency, and my parents had strategically chosen a week where finding professional help was virtually impossible. Theodore watched my frantic dialing from his recliner. He raised a frail hand, gesturing for me to stop. "Put the laptop away, Renee," he said, his voice raspy but steady. "You are looking in the wrong places. You do not need a firm. You need a specific predator." He instructed me to fetch his old leather address book from his bedroom nightstand. I retrieved the worn, cracked leather binder and handed it to him. He flipped through the yellowed pages, his finger tracing down a column of faded ink until it stopped on a direct cell phone number. "Call Valerie Knox," he instructed, sliding the book across the table. I frowned, looking at the unfamiliar name. "Grandpa, it is a holiday week. No prominent attorney is going to answer a blind call from a stranger right now." "She will answer," Theodore replied, a faint smile touching his lips. 20 years ago, Valerie was a young, broke lawyer fresh out of the bar exam. She had brilliant legal instincts, but was drowning in student debt. She needed an office to launch her practice, but no landlord in Orlando would take a chance on a girl with empty pockets. I owned that commercial plaza. I saw her grit, I handed her the keys to a corner suite, and told her to pay me rent whenever she won her first major settlement. She stayed in that building for 5 years. Today, she is a senior partner specializing in complex estate litigation. She owes me a life debt, and Valerie Knox is a woman who always balances her ledger. I picked up my phone and dialed the digits. It rang twice before a sharp, professional voice answered. "Valerie Knox speaking." I took a deep breath. "Ms. Knox, my name is Renee Henderson. I am calling on behalf of my grandfather, Theodore. He said you might remember him." The line went dead silent for 3 long seconds. When Valerie spoke again, the brisk, professional tone had melted into something deeply respectful. "Theodore, is he all right? Where are you?" I explained the situation in rapid, concise sentences. I told her about the sedatives, the upcoming flight, the impending threat of the state-run facility, and the rusted tackle box on the table. Valerie did not hesitate. "Give me your address," she said. "I am leaving my house right now. I will be there in 45 minutes. Do not let anyone else inside." Exactly 40 minutes later, a sleek charcoal sedan pulled into the driveway. A tall woman stepped out, wearing a tailored navy suit that looked sharp enough to cut glass. Her heels clicked decisively against the concrete walkway. I opened the front door, and Valerie Knox stepped into the living room, carrying a thick leather briefcase. Her eyes immediately locked onto Theodore. She walked past me, knelt beside his recliner, and took his hands in hers. "You look awful, old man," she said, her voice softening. "I survived worse," Theodore replied, gripping her hands firmly. "But I need your teeth on this one, Valerie. My son-in-law is trying to bury me while I am still breathing." Valerie stood up, her demeanor shifting instantly into battle mode. She walked over to the dining table and unclasped her briefcase. "Let us see the ammunition," she demanded. I handed her the documents from the tackle box. Valerie read through the blind trust, her eyes scanning the legal jargon with practiced speed. She flipped to the commercial deed, reviewing the parcel identification and the corporate lease agreement. A predatory smile spread across her face. "This is a masterpiece, Theodore," Valerie murmured, tapping the deed. "Your son-in-law has a generic boilerplate power of attorney. It grants him access to your personal checking and savings, but it is entirely useless against this specific blind trust. The Orlando property is shielded. David cannot touch it, sell it, or leverage it." I let out a long breath, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease. "So we just revoke the power of attorney and write a new will, leaving everything to me, right? We can finish this today." Valerie stopped smiling. She set the documents down and looked at me with cold, hard realism. "In a perfect world, yes, but we are operating in Florida probate law, Renee. Revoking a power of attorney requires the principal to be of sound mind, and your father has already poisoned that well." She explained the terrifying legal hurdle we now faced. David had not merely claimed Theodore was suffering from cognitive decline, he had officially documented it. David frequently played golf with a local, highly pliable physician. That corrupt doctor had signed off on a diagnosis of severe dementia without ever conducting a proper neurological examination. That diagnosis was currently sitting in Theodore's official medical file. "If I draft a new will and a revocation document today," Valerie explained, pacing the length of the dining room, "David will immediately contest it in court the moment he returns. He will waive that medical record in front of a judge. He will claim you manipulated a vulnerable, senile man into signing away his estate. The burden of proof will fall on us to prove otherwise. In probate court, a prior medical diagnosis of dementia is a brick wall. The judge would likely throw out our new documents, freeze the assets, and grant David emergency guardianship. We would lose everything." A heavy silence fell over the room. The Florida heat felt suffocating again. "How do we break the brick wall?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "We need a countermeasure," Valerie stated, leaning against the table. "We need an independent, board-certified psychiatrist to conduct a full cognitive evaluation on Theodore. We need a pristine, unassailable medical record stating that his mind is entirely sound and that the previous diagnosis was fraudulent. And we need that evaluation completed and filed before your parents' flight touches down in Tampa." Valerie pulled out her smartphone, scrolling rapidly through her contacts. "I am going to call every private medical expert in my network," she said, her thumbs flying across the screen. "I will find a doctor willing to do an emergency holiday consultation if I have to drag them out of their own living room." As Valerie dialed the first number, Theodore slowly pushed himself up from his recliner. The color had drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. He took a hesitant step toward the kitchen, leaning heavily on his wooden cane. "Grandpa," I said, stepping toward him, "let me get you some water." He tried to wave me off, but his hand began to tremble violently. The physical toll of flushing the heavy sedatives from his nervous system was finally catching up to his fragile body. His breathing hitched, transforming into a shallow, desperate wheeze. The cane slipped from his grasp, clattering loudly against the hardwood floor. Theodore grabbed the edge of the granite countertop, his knuckles turning white. His eyes widened in sudden, sheer panic. He clutched the center of his chest, letting out a terrible, ragged gasp. Before I could reach him, his knees buckled. He collapsed onto the kitchen tiles, his body convulsing as he struggled for air. The medical crisis had struck, and our ticking clock had just accelerated into a terrifying downward spiral. The sound of Theodore hitting the kitchen tile echoed like a gunshot. I dropped to my knees beside him. His chest heaved in shallow, erratic jerks. His lips were taking on a terrifying shade of blue. Valerie did not waste a single second screaming or panicking. She pulled her phone from her pocket and dialed 911, her voice a flat, authoritative bark as she relayed our address to the dispatcher. I held my grandfather, feeling the fragile bones of his shoulders beneath his thin cotton shirt. He gripped my wrist, his fingernails digging into my skin, fighting for every ounce of oxygen. The sudden cessation of those heavy chemical sedatives had thrown his central nervous system into a state of sheer chaos, triggering acute respiratory distress. The ambulance arrived in less than 7 minutes. Paramedics flooded the kitchen, lifting him onto a stretcher and strapping an oxygen mask over his face. I rode in the back, gripping his cold hand while the siren wailed through the humid Florida evening. The sterile, metallic scent of the ambulance made my stomach churn. I stared at the heart monitor tracking his erratic pulse, praying we were not too late. We arrived at Tampa General Hospital and the medical staff whisked him through the double doors into the emergency wing. I was left behind in a stark, freezing waiting room. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. I paced the linoleum floor, my mind racing. I pulled out my cell phone and dialed my father's number. It went straight to voicemail. I called my mother. Voicemail. I sent text after text, typing frantic sentences about Theodore collapsing, the ambulance, the respiratory failure. I pleaded with them to call me back. 45 agonizing minutes passed. I sat in a stiff plastic chair, staring at the blank screen of my phone. Finally, a notification chime broke the silence. A text message from Pamela appeared on the lock screen. I opened it, expecting fear, perhaps a question about which hospital we were at. Instead, the message read, "Ada Luau, stop being dramatic. Give him some NyQuil." I stared at those words until the letters blurred. A profound, icy clarity washed over me. Any lingering guilt I felt about tearing this family apart evaporated in an instant. They were sitting at a tropical resort, draped in floral leis, sipping expensive cocktails paid for with stolen money, while the man who provided that wealth was fighting for his life on a hospital bed. They did not care if he lived or died. In fact, his death would be highly convenient for their real estate plans. A physician in dark blue scrubs stepped through the swinging doors, calling my name. I stood up, bracing myself for the worst. Dr. Caldwell had a stern, deeply concerned expression on his face. He guided me into a quiet corner of the hallway, holding a tablet containing the initial laboratory results. "Your grandfather is stabilized," Dr. Caldwell began, his voice lowered. "We administered a respiratory stimulant and put him on high-flow oxygen. But I need you to explain something to me right now. The toxicology screening just came back. His blood is saturated with extremely high levels of a specific prescription tranquilizer. The dosage in his system is dangerously elevated for a man his age. It is the root cause of this severe withdrawal and subsequent respiratory failure. Who is managing his medication?" This was the moment. The hidden weapon we needed had just handed itself to us on a silver platter. I looked the physician squarely in the eye. "My parents are his primary caregivers," I explained, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. "They flew to Hawaii 3 days ago and left me to watch him. They told me those pills were his daily vitamins. I realized what they were and threw them away. Dr. Caldwell, they have been keeping him chemically subdued for 2 years, claiming he suffers from late-stage dementia so they can seize his estate." The physician's expression shifted from professional concern to sheer outrage. He processed my words, glancing back at the tablet in his hands. He asked me to follow him into the recovery room. Theodore was propped up in a hospital bed, the oxygen mask resting beneath his chin. His color was returning. He looked tired, worn down by the ordeal, but his blue eyes tracked us with perfect, sharp awareness. Dr. Caldwell approached the bed, pulling a small penlight from his pocket. He began a rigorous cognitive assessment, asking a series of complex questions designed to test memory, spatial reasoning, and critical thinking. Theodore did not stumble once. He stated the current date, the name of the sitting president, and recounted his previous career in international freight logistics with flawless detail. When Dr. Caldwell asked him to count backward from 100 by sevens, Theodore did it faster than I could calculate in my own head. The physician turned off his penlight and slipped it back into his pocket. He looked at Theodore, then turned to me. "There is zero evidence of dementia here," Dr. Caldwell stated firmly. "This man is experiencing profound physical exhaustion due to negligent chemical restraint, but his cognitive faculties are pristine." I felt a surge of hope. "Dr. Caldwell," I said, taking a step forward, "my father has a medical file claiming my grandfather is incompetent. He plans to use it to force him into a state-run ward next week. Can you put today's assessment on the official record?" "I am doing more than that," the physician replied, typing rapidly onto his tablet. "I am overriding the previous diagnosis. I am formally documenting his absolute cognitive lucidity on his permanent medical chart. Any judge looking at these toxicology reports alongside my psychiatric evaluation will immediately see the prior diagnosis was a fabrication. I am also flagging this case in our system for potential elder endangerment." We had done it. We had broken the brick wall. The undeniable medical proof we needed to rewrite the will was now secured in the hospital database, backed by a board-certified emergency physician. By early evening, Theodore was cleared for discharge. The withdrawal symptoms had subsided, and his breathing returned to a normal, steady rhythm. I helped him into the passenger seat of my car, buckling his seatbelt. He looked out the window at the setting Florida sun, a quiet, victorious smile resting on his face. We were halfway home, cruising down the interstate, when my phone rang through the Bluetooth speakers of the car dashboard. The caller ID displayed Valerie Knox. I pressed the button on the steering wheel to accept the call. "Are you two still breathing?" Valerie asked, her sharp voice filling the vehicle cabin. "We are better than breathing," I replied, merging into the center lane. "We have the medical evaluation. The doctor formally documented his mental competence and flagged the chemical abuse. The prior dementia claim is officially dead." "Excellent work," Valerie said, but her tone remained tight, coiled with urgent tension. Because the situation just escalated. You need to drive faster. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. What is wrong? While you were at the hospital, I used my firm resources to run a deep forensic audit on that dummy checking account your father has been managing, Valerie explained, the rapid clicking of a keyboard echoing in the background. I tracked the routing numbers on his most recent withdrawals. The Hawaii trip is not just a family vacation, Renee. My blood ran cold. What do you mean? David is not spending his days on the beach, Valerie continued, dropping the explosive truth. The audit revealed a series of wire transfers initiated from Maui to a financial institution in the Cayman Islands. Your father is secretly meeting with a shady offshore broker this week. He is setting up a shell corporation to funnel your grandfather's stolen cash out of the country before the new tax year begins on January 1st. I glanced at Theodore. His jaw tightened, the lines around his mouth deepening into a hardened scowl. If David successfully moves those funds offshore, Valerie warned, her voice deadly serious, retrieving that stolen money will become a jurisdictional nightmare. We cannot wait until they return on the 3rd. The deadline has shifted. We have to spring the legal trap the moment their return flight touches the tarmac, before he can finalize the wire transfers. Bring the old man home right now. We have documents to draft. The tires of my sedan crunched loudly against the gravel driveway, breaking the heavy silence of the humid Tampa night. Valerie Knox was already waiting on the concrete front porch, her figure illuminated by the amber glow of the security light. She clutched a thick, expanding folder bursting with printed financial records. I parked the vehicle and hurried around to help Theodore out of the passenger seat. His steps were slower than before our chaotic trip to the emergency room, but his posture remained rigid and undeniably defiant. The chemical haze had vanished from his eyes, replaced by a sharp, calculating focus. We walked through the front door into the stifling house. Valerie did not waste time with pleasantries. She marched straight into the dining room and spread the contents of her dense folder across the polished oak table. The sheer volume of paper was visually staggering, a mountain of evidence detailing years of covert betrayal. We are operating on a rapidly narrowing window, Valerie stated, tapping a freshly printed bank statement with a manicured fingernail. Your father is not just taking a tropical vacation. He is executing a highly calculated extraction of assets. She pointed to a series of pending transactions highlighted in fluorescent yellow ink. David initiated 3 separate wire transfers yesterday afternoon from a private lounge in Maui. He is attempting to route the remaining balance of the decoy checking account through a notoriously opaque shell corporation based in the Cayman Islands. If those specific funds clear the international holding period, they will vanish into a jurisdiction where United States probate courts possess zero leverage. We have to freeze his access before the financial institutions reopen after the holiday weekend. My eyes scanned the ledger, tracing the relentless outflow of cash. The offshore wires were terrifying, but another column of recurring expenses caught my immediate attention. It was a secondary credit card linked directly to Theodore's primary retirement fund. The merchant names listed on the statement read like a luxury shopping catalog: high-end designer boutiques, premium European auto dealerships, exclusive downtown cosmetic clinics, and expensive organic pet food suppliers. My sister Courtney did not possess an actual trust fund. She did not earn her lavish lifestyle through lucrative brand sponsorships or diligent hard work. Every single overpriced cocktail, every genuine leather handbag, every month of rent for her pristine downtown loft was quietly subsidized by the very man she refused to visit. She was draining his life savings to fund her fake digital facade. Theodore looked down at the itemized bills. A quiet, sorrowful shadow passed over his weathered face before hardening into unyielding steel. She took my money while eagerly helping them plan my funeral, he whispered, tracing a pale finger over a particularly exorbitant jewelry purchase. The betrayal ran far deeper than simple neglect. It was a predatory feast. My smartphone vibrated intensely in my pocket. I pulled the device out and tapped the glass screen. A new video update from Courtney had just posted to her social media feed. The volume was low, but her high-pitched, boastful voice drifted through the quiet dining room. She was twirling on a pristine white sand beach, wearing a sheer silk cover-up that likely cost more than my first vehicle. She held a tropical drink garnished with a tiny umbrella. The caption flashing across the screen read, "Building generational wealth takes hustle, but thank heaven for the Family Trust Fund." I watched the video loop, a bitter, hollow laugh escaping my throat. The irony hung in the room like a physical weight. Courtney was posing for her thousands of followers, bragging about a trust fund that never belonged to her, oblivious to the fact that her financial lifeline was currently sitting across from a ruthless attorney, preparing to sever the cord forever. While Courtney twirled for the camera, Valerie pulled a fresh stack of legal documents from her leather briefcase. The time for sorrow had officially passed. It was time to execute the defense. Valerie laid the first document in front of Theodore, smoothing the crisp white paper. "This is the immediate revocation of the power of attorney," the lawyer explained, handing him a heavy brass pen. "The moment you sign this page, David loses all legal authority over your health and your finances. His signature on any future transaction becomes legally void. He will be locked out of every domestic account instantly." Theodore took the heavy pen. His hand did not shake. The toxic sedatives were gone, leaving behind only crisp, unclouded determination. He pressed the metal nib to the paper and signed his name with bold, sweeping strokes. Valerie slid the next document forward. "This is your new healthcare surrogate designation. Renee is now the sole individual authorized to make medical decisions on your behalf. Sunset Pines is no longer an option." Theodore signed the second page without a fraction of hesitation. Finally, Valerie presented the last will and testament. This specific document was the ultimate weapon in our arsenal. It outlined the transfer of the Tampa residence, the remaining bank accounts, and the hidden blind trust holding the $4.2 million commercial property in Orlando. Valerie had structured the legal language to be entirely impenetrable. Every single asset was left exclusively to me. David, Pamela, and Courtney were explicitly named and intentionally excluded from receiving a single cent of the estate. Theodore read every line, a deep sense of profound satisfaction radiating from his tired frame. He signed the final page, permanently securing the future they had tried to steal. But Valerie was not finished. "A signature can be contested," she stated, opening her sleek laptop and adjusting the internal camera lens. "Your father will march into probate court, waive his fraudulent dementia diagnosis, and claim Renee coerced a confused old man into signing these papers. We need to bulletproof this transaction. We need to leave the judge with zero room for interpretation or doubt." Valerie positioned the laptop at the end of the dining table, ensuring the ambient lighting captured Theodore perfectly. She pressed the record button. A red light blinked steadily in the dim room. Theodore sat up straight, squaring his frail shoulders. He stared directly into the camera lens. The man looking into that recording device was not a weak, senile victim. He was a sharp, formidable patriarch, delivering a final, devastating verdict. "My name is Theodore," he began, his voice ringing clear and highly authoritative. "I am recording this statement of my own free will, free from any outside influence or duress. I am speaking directly to any judge or legal authority reviewing my estate in the future. My son-in-law David and my daughter Pamela have spent the last 2 years systematically poisoning me with unauthorized sedatives. They manufactured a false narrative of cognitive decline to steal my wealth and plot my institutionalization. My granddaughter Courtney eagerly participated in this theft, financing a fraudulent influencer lifestyle using my stolen retirement funds." Theodore did not blink. His gaze was piercing, an arrow aimed straight at the heart of their unchecked greed. "I leave them nothing," he declared, his tone unwavering. "I explicitly disinherit David, Pamela, and Courtney. They have shown zero compassion and profound cruelty toward me. I am leaving the entirety of my estate to my granddaughter Renee, the only person who stood between me and a state-run facility. Any attempt by David to contest this will is a direct continuation of his financial exploitation and abuse." Valerie reached across the table and stopped the recording, the digital file saved to her encrypted hard drive, locking away the undeniable truth. The legal trap was set, loaded, and waiting for the trigger. The room fell silent, the sheer magnitude of what we had just accomplished settling over us like a protective shield. We had severed their power and secured the fortune. Now we just had to wait for them to walk blindly into the ambush. I gathered the signed documents and placed them in a neat, organized pile. Just as I reached for my smartphone to check the time, a new text message flashed across the illuminated screen. It was from David. The message read, "The island weather turned sour. We changed our flight. Landing tomorrow morning instead of the 3rd. Have his bags packed for Sunset Pines. The transport van arrives at noon." I stared at the glowing screen, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Our 10-day cushion had just vanished into thin air. The enemy was already at the gates. The morning sun breached the horizon, painting the Tampa sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. My father's text message echoed in my mind, a relentless drumbeat warning of their early return. The 10-day buffer we had counted on was gone, vanishing like mist over the Gulf. Valerie had left the house just after midnight, her briefcase packed with our signed countermeasures, but not before delivering one final crucial piece of advice. "Play dumb," she had instructed, standing in the doorway with the Florida humidity clinging to her sharp suit. "If David walks in and senses a trap, he will pivot. He will call his own legal counsel before I can serve the revocation. You have to let him believe he still holds all the cards. Give him exactly what he expects to see." I walked into Theodore's bedroom. The air felt still, thick with the history of a man who had spent decades building a life only to have his own flesh and blood try to strip it away. I pulled a roll of heavy-duty black trash bags from the kitchen pantry. David had demanded Theodore's belongings be packed for the state-run facility, a place synonymous with neglect. I was going to give him a masterpiece of compliance. I grabbed handfuls of old, worn flannel shirts, faded trousers, and mismatched socks, stuffing them roughly into the plastic sacks. I tied the tops with tight, unforgiving knots, leaving the bags slouched against the hallway wall like discarded refuse. It looked exactly like the careless, heartless eviction my parents had ordered. Next, I fired up my laser printer. I navigated to the official website for Sunset Pines, the bleak, underfunded facility they had chosen for him. The printer hummed, spitting out their promotional brochure in bright, deceptive colors. I placed the glossy pages squarely on the kitchen island, right next to Theodore's empty pill organizer and a hastily packed overnight duffel bag. The stage was set. It was a flawless visual lie, designed to make David and Pamela lower their guard the second they turned the key in the lock. They needed to see a defeated daughter and a broken old man. Despite the ironclad legal armor we had forged the night before, a cold knot of anxiety twisted in my stomach. I stood in the center of the living room, staring at the black garbage bags. I was about to drop a match on my entire lineage. Pamela was the woman who taught me how to tie my shoes. David was the man who cheered at my high school graduation, even if he spent the ceremony checking his email on a BlackBerry. Courtney and I used to share secrets under blanket forts before her obsession with digital status consumed her personality. Was I really doing this? Was I about to fracture my family beyond any hope of repair? My pulse drummed in my ears. I felt a warm, weathered hand rest on my shoulder. I turned around. Theodore was standing behind me, leaning lightly on his wooden cane. The sickly chemical pallor was gone from his cheeks, replaced by a steady, vital flush. He looked at the garbage bags, then looked into my eyes, reading the hesitation swimming in my mind. "You are agonizing over breaking something that is already shattered, Renee," he said, his voice a low, comforting gravel. "Blood is just a biological accident. It does not excuse cruelty. You are not destroying this family. The family was destroyed by greed years ago. You are just sweeping up the glass so nobody else gets cut." His words anchored me. The sudden spike of guilt evaporated, replaced by a cold, clinical resolve. He was right. They had made their choice the moment they ground those heavy sedatives into his meals. They chose the Hawaiian sun over his safety. Now they were going to reap the harvest of those choices. I walked over to the oak dining table and pulled out a sleek black leather portfolio I used for high-level marketing pitches. Today, it would hold a different kind of presentation. I opened the binder, the metal ring snapping apart with a sharp click, and began sliding our evidence into the clear plastic sleeves, curating a timeline of undeniable betrayal. Page 1 was the official hospital toxicology report. The bold black text detailed the dangerous levels of prescription tranquilizers flooding Theodore's bloodstream, accompanied by the emergency physician's sworn statement of cognitive lucidity. Page 2 held the stack of final notice tax bills from the Hillsborough County Collector, proving my father's gross financial negligence. Page 3 was a printed spreadsheet of the Decoy checking account. I used a bright yellow highlighter to mark the wire transfers David had initiated from a luxury lounge to the Cayman Islands. Finally, I added the digital receipts. Crisp, high-resolution screenshots of Courtney's social media posts boasting about her fake generational wealth, printed side by side with the text message Pamela sent while Theodore was fighting for his life in the emergency room. "Give him some NyQuil." I snapped the binder shut. The leather felt heavy, dense with consequence. I placed it perfectly in the center of the table, aligning the edges with the wood grain. The weapon was loaded and waiting. The waiting was the hardest part. The morning stretched into midday. The Florida heat radiated through the window panes, baking the asphalt outside. I paced the length of the living room, reviewing Valerie's instructions. Keep them talking, let them claim their authority, let them step fully into the snare before pulling the rope. Theodore sat in his familiar fabric recliner. He held a mug of black coffee, sipping it with the calm demeanor of a general watching a battlefield unfold from a high ridge. He did not look like a victim anymore. He looked like a man ready to reclaim his kingdom. At 12:14, the low rumble of a heavy engine echoed down the quiet suburban street. I stepped toward the front window, peeling back the edge of the plantation shutter just enough to peer outside. A pristine black sport utility vehicle rolled to a stop at the curb. The tires crunched over the dry grass clippings. The driver, wearing a dark suit, stepped out and opened the rear doors. My heart slammed against my ribs. My family poured onto the sun-baked driveway. Pamela emerged first, wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat and a flowing resort dress, her skin baked to a deep, unnatural terracotta shade. She complained loudly to the driver about the humidity, her voice piercing the quiet neighborhood. David followed, sporting linen trousers and a smug, relaxed posture. He looked like a man who had just conquered the world, oblivious to the fact that his empire had already fallen. Courtney stepped out last, glued to her smartphone, adjusting oversized designer sunglasses as she navigated the concrete path in impractical wedge sandals. The driver opened the rear hatch, unloading a mountain of expensive luggage, sleek hard-shell suitcases and oversized canvas totes piled up on the driveway. They had brought the Island excess back with them, a visual testament to the money they had stolen. I watched my father pull a thick wad of cash from his money clip, tipping the driver with a grandiose flick of his wrist. He turned toward the house, adjusting his expensive polo shirt, ready to play the commanding patriarch one last time. I let the shutter fall back into place, plunging the room back into dim, cool shadows. The room fell silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. They were marching up the front walkway, their heavy footsteps echoing on the concrete steps. The brass doorknob began to turn. The deadbolt clicked open. They were walking blindly into the execution chamber, entirely convinced they were arriving for a coronation. The front door swung inward, striking the wall stopper with a sharp, heavy thud. A wave of suffocating afternoon heat washed into the air-conditioned living room, carrying the distinct scent of coconut tanning oil and stale airplane cabin air. Pamela crossed the threshold first. She dragged a large, hard-shell suitcase behind her, the plastic wheels grinding loudly against the pristine tile floor. Her skin was baked to an unnatural deep terracotta shade, peeling slightly around her nose. She let go of the luggage handle, waving a hand in front of her face in a theatrical display of disgust. "This place smells like a hospital ward," Pamela complained, her voice shrill and grating in the quiet space. "Did you even bother opening a window while we were gone? It feels like a tomb in here." Courtney followed right on her heels. She did not bother looking up from the glowing screen of her smartphone. She wore oversized designer sunglasses indoors, her feet clad in impractical wedge sandals that clacked rhythmically on the floorboards. She stopped near the entryway and let a heavy canvas tote bag slide off her shoulder, dropping it unceremoniously at my feet. "Take that up to the guest room," Courtney ordered, her tone thick with casual entitlement. "My shoulders are peeling from the sun, and I cannot lift anything heavy today. And make sure you do not scratch the leather trim." For 30 years, this was the exact family dynamic. I was the reliable, invisible older sister, expected to manage the logistics, carry the burdens, and absorb the inconvenience. Courtney was the cherished golden child, shielded from every hardship and rewarded for merely existing. I looked down at the canvas tote, then looked back up at her sunburned face. I did not move a single muscle. I did not say a word. I simply stood my ground, my hands resting calmly at my sides. David entered last. He stepped through the doorway, projecting the aura of a conquering corporate executive returning from a victorious merger. He wore a wrinkled linen shirt unbuttoned at the collar, a pair of expensive sunglasses perched on his head. He closed the door behind him and surveyed the living room. His gaze swept past me, past the dining table where my black leather binder sat waiting, and landed directly on the hallway wall. He saw the heavy-duty black garbage bags slouched against the baseboards. He saw the printed glossy brochure for Sunset Pines resting on the kitchen island alongside the empty plastic pill organizer. A slow, predatory smile spread across my father's face. The tension in his shoulders vanished. The red herring had worked flawlessly. He believed I had surrendered to his authority. "I see you finally found some common sense, Renee," David declared, his voice booming with arrogant satisfaction. He walked into the center of the living room, clapping his hands together once. "I knew you would realize this is the only logical step forward. Caring for him is too much of a burden for anyone, let alone someone with your limited capabilities." He did not bother to greet the man he was talking about. Theodore sat in his worn fabric recliner just a few feet away. My grandfather held a ceramic mug of dark roast coffee. He did not tremble. He did not slouch. He brought the rim of the mug to his lips, taking a slow, deliberate sip. Over the rim of the cup, his piercing blue eyes tracked my father's every movement. It was a brilliant, quiet moment of sheer predatory patience. Theodore watched his biological daughter and his son-in-law dig their own graves with eager, oblivious enthusiasm. David turned his attention back to me, adopting the tone of a manager delegating tasks to a subordinate. "We are moving on an accelerated timeline now," he announced, tapping his expensive wristwatch. "I arranged for the state medical transport van to arrive here at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. They will take him directly to the admission wing at Sunset Pines. You need to ensure he is dressed and waiting by the door. I have a real estate broker coming at noon to conduct the initial staging walkthrough. We are listing this property by Monday." The room grew very still. The only sound was the faint hum of the central air conditioning unit kicking into high gear. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs. "Cancel the transport van," I said. My voice was quiet, measured, and entirely devoid of fear. David stopped halfway to the kitchen. He slowly turned his head, his predatory smile faltering, replaced by a deep, irritated frown. "Excuse me?" he snapped. "You heard me," I replied, keeping my posture straight. "Cancel the transport. Theodore is not going to that facility tomorrow. He is staying right here in his own home, and this property is not being listed on Monday or any other day." Pamela let out a harsh, mocking laugh, tossing her straw hat onto the sofa. "Oh, please do not start with the righteous defender routine, Renee. You spent 2 weeks playing nurse, and now you think you have a say in adult matters? You do not." David did not laugh. The veins in his neck began to bulge. The deep sunburn on his face shifted into a dangerous, dark crimson. He closed the distance between us in 3 long, forceful strides. He stopped mere inches from my face, towering over me. The smell of stale scotch, sweat, and expensive cologne radiated off his skin. In the past, this tactic would have worked. His physical intimidation used to make me shrink, apologize, and retreat into silence. Today, I did not flinch. I stared directly into his furious eyes. "Listen to me very carefully, little girl," David hissed, his voice dropping into a vicious, menacing register. "I am the legal power of attorney. I hold the authority in this family. I make the medical decisions. I control the financial assets. I decide who stays and who goes. You have zero power here." He pointed a thick finger at my chest, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched. "If you try to defy me on this, I will have the local police physically remove you from my property for trespassing. You can pack your bags and live out of your car for all I care. You either fall in line right now or you are out on the street." From the corner of the room, a new sound cut through the heavy tension. It was the sharp electronic chime of a smartphone camera activating. I shifted my gaze slightly. Courtney had pulled her device from her pocket. She held it up, the glowing screen aimed directly at my face, a smug, venomous grin plastered across her lips. "Keep talking, Wren," Courtney taunted, stepping closer to ensure she captured a clear angle. "Say all of that again for the camera. Let everyone see how unhinged and hysterical you are acting. When Dad takes you to court for interfering with a medical transfer, this footage is going to be perfect evidence." They thought they held every single card. They thought intimidation and digital threats would force my compliance. They had no idea they were standing on a trap door, and my hand was resting firmly on the lever. I looked at David's furious face, then glanced over at Courtney's glowing phone screen. A calm, chilling smile spread across my lips. I slowly raised my left arm and checked the dial on my wristwatch. It was exactly 1 minute past 1 in the afternoon. "Right on time," I whispered. Before David could demand to know what I meant, the sharp melodic chime of the front doorbell echoed through the silent house. 3 firm, decisive knocks followed the chime. Courtney lowered her phone, her smug expression replaced by a look of profound confusion. David stepped back, his brow furrowing in irritation. He turned his head toward the entryway, clearly expecting a lost delivery driver or a premature visit from his real estate broker. He had no idea the destruction of his entire empire was currently standing on the other side of that wooden door. The sharp, melodic chime of the doorbell rang out a second time, followed by 3 firm knocks against the heavy mahogany wood. The sound cut through the hostile air in the living room, freezing my father mid-sentence. Courtney let out a dramatic sigh, rolling her eyes behind her oversized designer sunglasses. She kept her smartphone raised, the camera lens still pointed directly at my face, determined to capture my impending eviction. "Did you order takeout to celebrate getting thrown out on the street?" she sneered, her voice dripping with bored condescension. "Or is this the discount real estate staging consultant Mom hired for the afternoon?" Courtney pivoted on her wedge sandals and marched toward the foyer. She yanked the front door open, ready to unleash her irritation on whoever stood on the front porch. The blast of humid, sun-baked Florida air rushed inside, but the person standing on the threshold brought a distinct chill into the room. It was Valerie Knox. She did not look like a cut-rate real estate broker. She looked like a highly weaponized corporate shark stepping onto a battlefield she had already conquered. Valerie wore a tailored navy pinstripe suit that fit with flawless precision, a crisp white silk blouse, and carried a thick, battered leather briefcase that practically hummed with authority. Her gaze bypassed my sister entirely, dismissing Courtney as if she were a minor piece of furniture. David puffed out his chest, stepping forward to reassert his dominance over the household. He checked the face of his luxury wristwatch, a scowl deepening the sunburned wrinkles on his forehead. "You are early," he barked, waving a hand dismissively toward the open doorway. "If you are the staging consultant Pamela requested, you need to wait outside. We already have an exclusive listing broker handling the sale of this property, so we just need a surface aesthetic opinion. The place is a teardown anyway, so do not bother bringing in any expensive props." Valerie did not blink. She did not bother to introduce herself as a real estate agent, nor did she acknowledge his pointing finger. She stepped over the threshold with quiet, lethal grace. Her heels struck the ceramic tile with the steady, rhythmic precision of a metronome ticking down to an explosion. She walked directly past my father, leaving him standing there with his mouth half open, entirely ignored in a space he believed he commanded. Valerie stopped beside the worn fabric recliner. She looked down at my grandfather, her stern expression softening for a fraction of a second. "Theodore, how is the breathing today?" "Clearer than it has been in 2 long years, Valerie," my grandfather replied. His voice carried a rich, steady timbre that resonated through the quiet living room, devoid of the raspy weakness they were accustomed to hearing. The color drained from David's face before surging back in a dark, furious flush. He spun around, his hands balling into tight fists at his sides. "Excuse me? Who do you think you are, marching into my house and speaking to my patient?" Valerie turned slowly. She assessed my father from his peeling forehead down to his wrinkled linen trousers, her eyes performing a ruthless, silent calculation. Your house, she repeated, the words rolling off her tongue like polished stones. I must have missed that specific deed transfer in the county records. I am Valerie Knox. I serve as the primary legal counsel for the sole owner of this property, Theodore. Pamela let out a high nasal scoff, tossing her head back. Her resort dress rustled as she crossed her arms over her chest. Legal counsel. That is a hilarious joke. My father is senile. He cannot hire a lawyer. He cannot even operate a television remote without supervision. My husband holds the formal power of attorney over his estate, which means you are trespassing on private property. David, call the police right now and have this scam artist removed. Valerie did not reach for the door. She walked to the center of the room and placed her thick leather briefcase directly onto the oak dining table, right next to my black portfolio. The brass latches popped open with two sharp, echoing clicks. I strongly advise against involving law enforcement, Pamela, Valerie stated, her voice dropping to a cool, dangerous register, unless you are eager to explain the contents of his recent blood work to a uniformed officer. Valerie reached into the briefcase and retrieved a crisp white folder. She held it up, the stark paper catching the afternoon light filtering through the plantation shutters. This is a sworn medical evaluation from the attending emergency room physician at Tampa General Hospital, dated 3 days ago. It includes a comprehensive cognitive assessment and a full toxicology panel. The smug satisfaction on Courtney's face began to falter. Her thumb hovered over the glowing red record button on her smartphone screen. The lens was still pointed at the dining table, but her wrist was beginning to shake. The attending physician, Valerie continued, her tone ringing with the clarity of a striking bell, found Theodore to be in pristine mental health. He scored perfectly on every spatial, memory, and logical reasoning metric required by the state of Florida. The doctor formally documented that Theodore possesses unassailable cognitive lucidity. David took a menacing step forward, pointing an accusing finger at the lawyer. That is impossible. I have paperwork. A highly respected doctor diagnosed him with late-stage cognitive decline 18 months ago. You cannot just erase a medical history. You have a piece of paper signed by a golf buddy who never conducted a proper neurological exam, Valerie corrected, her eyes locking onto my father with unyielding intensity. What I have is a certified hospital record overriding that previous diagnosis. It legally establishes that Theodore is entirely competent to manage his own affairs. Furthermore, the hospital documented a dangerous elevated level of unauthorized prescription sedatives in his system. They classified his recent respiratory failure as a direct result of negligent chemical restraint. Pamela stumbled backward, her shoulder hitting the wall. The deep terracotta tan on her face vanished, leaving her cheeks a mottled, sickly pale. She stared at the white folder in Valerie's hand, her mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. Courtney lowered her phone. The glowing screen went dark. The realization that she had just recorded herself taunting a lucid man who was chemically abused by her own parents finally penetrated her curated digital bubble. She slid the device into her pocket, her hands trembling as she took a slow step away from her father. The disastrous shift in the room's power dynamic hung heavy in the stifling air, suffocating their arrogant entitlement. The medical facade is dead, David, Valerie stated, reaching into the white folder and extracting a thick, legal-sized document printed on heavy parchment. Your convenient narrative of dementia has been eradicated by science. Theodore is legally competent, which means he retains the unalienable right to change his legal representation, his medical surrogate, and his financial oversight. She stepped forward and held the document out toward my father. David stared at the paper, refusing to lift his hand. His jaw hung slack. The aggressive, towering posture he had used to intimidate me just moments earlier collapsed inward. He looked at Valerie, then at Theodore, then at me, his eyes darting frantically as he searched for an escape route that did not exist. "Take it," Valerie ordered. It was not a request. It was an undeniable command. David reached out, his fingers brushing the stiff parchment. He pulled the document toward his chest, his eyes dropping to the bold, capitalized letters printed across the top of the page. I stood quietly near the kitchen island, watching the exact second his brain processed the legal terminology. The predatory smirk he had worn since walking through the front door wiped away, replaced by a profound, suffocating dread. The paper in his trembling hands was about to strip away everything he thought he controlled. David stared at the heavy parchment. His eyes darted back and forth across the bold legal print, his pupils dilating as the weight of the terminology registered in his brain. His fingers trembled, causing the edges of the paper to vibrate with a faint, rhythmic rattle. It was the formal, legally binding revocation of his power of attorney. The document was meticulously drafted, filed, and notarized, acting as a guillotine severing him from the financial kingdom he thought he ruled. Valerie stepped closer, invading his personal space with calculated precision. "As of 9 o'clock this morning," she stated, her voice slicing through the heavy living room air, "you possess zero legal authority over Theodore. You cannot make medical decisions for him. You cannot sign contracts on his behalf. You are legally barred from acting as his agent in any capacity. Your reign over his life is finished." Pamela let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. She pushed herself away from the wall, her resort dress billowing around her ankles as she stomped toward the dining table. "You cannot do this," she yelled, pointing a manicured finger at the attorney. "We are his family. We have dedicated the last 2 years of our lives to caring for him. We sacrificed our time and our comfort to keep him safe. We have primary caregiver rights, and no jumped-up lawyer is going to walk into my house and strip those away." Valerie turned to face my mother, her expression devoid of any sympathy. She reached into her leather briefcase and pulled out the black presentation binder I had assembled earlier that morning. She flipped it open and extracted 2 glossy, high-resolution printed photographs. She laid them side by side on the polished oak table, tapping the surface to draw their attention. "Let's examine your definition of sacrifice, Pamela," Valerie offered, her tone lethal and calm. On the left side of the table sat a printed screenshot from Courtney's social media feed. It featured my sister lounging in a private Maui cabana, holding a hollowed-out pineapple cocktail, boasting about island breezes and zero stress. On the right side sat a blown-up printout of the text message Pamela had sent me while I was sitting in the freezing hospital emergency room. Valerie read the text message out loud, emphasizing every cruel syllable. "At a luau. Stop being dramatic. Give him some NyQuil." She looked up, her gaze pinning my mother in place. "Your father was suffocating from respiratory failure induced by the unauthorized tranquilizers you forced down his throat. And your prescribed medical treatment was a grocery store cough syrup while you attended a tropical beach party. Do not dare stand in front of me and invoke caregiver rights." Pamela stared at the printed text message, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The righteous indignation drained from her face, replaced by the suffocating realization that her cruelty was now a permanent, undeniable record. But Valerie was just getting started. She turned her attention back to my father, who was still gripping the revoked power of attorney document as if it might magically become valid again. "You thought you were incredibly clever, David," Valerie continued, pulling a thick stack of forensic accounting reports from her briefcase. "You assumed you were outsmarting a fragile old man, but Theodore built a decoy checking account specifically to monitor your greed. And my firm has spent the last 48 hours tracking every single dollar you siphoned from it." David swallowed hard. His sunburned skin turned a sickly pale shade of green. Valerie dropped the banking ledgers onto the table. The pages detailed years of systemic theft. "We have the wire logs," she announced, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "We know you spent yesterday afternoon in a luxury lounge in Hawaii, attempting to route the remaining balance of Theodore's funds to a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands. You tried to offshore the money before the new tax year to avoid federal scrutiny." Courtney gasped, taking a step away from her parents. "Offshore," she whispered, her eyes wide with sudden panic. Valerie did not let the momentum stall. She turned her sharp gaze onto my sister. "Oh, do not act shocked, Courtney. Your hands are just as dirty." The forensic audit uncovered a secondary credit card linked directly to Theodore's retirement fund. The statements show 3 years of high-end retail purchases, European car lease payments, and luxury downtown loft rent. Your entire influencer lifestyle, every designer handbag and organic pet food delivery was stolen directly from your grandfather. I watched my sister process the exposure. Her curated digital world was evaporating before her very eyes. She looked at the banking ledgers, then looked at our father, her face contorting into a mask of frantic self-preservation. "I did not know the money was stolen," Courtney shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly in the confined space. She pointed an accusing finger at David, throwing him under the bus without a second of hesitation. "Dad told me it was a bonus from his real estate investments. He said he was managing the trust and that it was my early inheritance. I am a victim here. He lied to me." David dropped the revocation papers, spinning around to face his youngest daughter. His fists were clenched tight enough to turn his knuckles white. "Shut your mouth, Courtney," he roared, the veins in his neck bulging dangerously. "You happily swiped that credit card every single day. You never asked where the cash came from because you were too busy posing for strangers on the internet." Pamela jumped into the fray, her panic manifesting as pure, unfiltered rage. She shoved David hard in the chest. "You idiot!" she screamed, her voice cracking under the strain. "I told you to cover the tracks. I told you to use secure channels, but you had to play the big-shot international investor. You left a digital trail leading straight to the islands, and now this lawyer has everything." "You are blaming me," David shouted back, looming over his wife. "Your spoiled daughter is the one who documented our entire vacation on a public platform. She literally posted a confession of generational wealth for the whole world to see. I was managing the logistics, and you two broadcasted it." The toxic family ecosystem was cannibalizing itself right in front of me. The united front they had projected for decades shattered into a million jagged pieces. They were no longer the polished, wealthy suburbanites who looked down on the rest of the world. They were cornered predators turning their fangs on each other in a desperate bid for survival. Pamela blamed David for his sloppy execution. David blamed Courtney for her digital vanity. Courtney cried real tears, furious that her endless supply of stolen designer goods had just been permanently severed. Valerie watched the implosion with cold, professional detachment. She reached into her suit jacket and produced a final, sealed envelope. She held it out, forcing David to break away from his screaming match with his wife. "This is a formal legal notice," Valerie declared, her voice cutting through their chaotic shouting. "As of 10 minutes ago, my firm placed an emergency freeze on every domestic account linked to your name, David. The financial institutions have flagged your profiles for suspected fraud. The offshore wire transfers were intercepted and halted by federal banking compliance algorithms. You cannot access Theodore's money. You cannot even access your own personal checking accounts until this investigation concludes. You are entirely frozen out of the financial system." David took the envelope, his hands shaking so fiercely he nearly dropped it onto the floor. The reality of his situation crashed over him like a suffocating wave. He was locked out. The funds he needed to maintain his luxury cars, his mortgage, and his country club memberships were gone. He looked around the living room, his breathing shallow and erratic, searching for a lifeline. I stood silently near the kitchen island, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the destruction. For my entire life, I had been conditioned to believe these three people were untouchable. They operated with a sense of invincibility, assuming their status shielded them from consequence. Now, stripped of their stolen resources and exposed by their own documented cruelty, they looked small. The power dynamic had inverted. Then, a new realization seemed to spark behind David's desperate eyes. His gaze snapped toward my grandfather, who was still sitting calmly in the recliner, watching the destruction with quiet satisfaction. David straightened his posture, wiping a bead of sweat from his peeling forehead. The panic began to recede, replaced by a dark, triumphant sneer. He believed he still held one final trump card. David let out a low, bitter chuckle. He tossed the freeze notice onto the dining table, dismissing it with a hostile flick of his wrist. He smoothed the front of his wrinkled linen shirt, attempting to gather the shattered fragments of his dignity. "Fine," David spat, his voice dripping with venom. "Freeze the accounts. Lock down the decoy funds. You think you have won because you caught me moving a few $1,000s around to protect the family estate, but you are forgetting one crucial detail, Valerie." Pamela stopped crying, sniffing loudly as she turned to watch her husband. Courtney lowered her hands from her face, hanging on his every word, desperate for a reversal of fortune. David took a deliberate step toward my grandfather, a cruel smile twisting his features. "He does not have long left," David announced, pointing a thumb at the frail man in the chair. "You can revoke the power of attorney all you want. You can play your little legal games today. But the moment his heart stops ticking, that original last will and testament dictates everything. Pamela is the sole designated heir. This house, the remaining portfolio, the entire estate defaults to my wife." He leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the oak table, projecting a false sense of renewed victory. "We will just wait you out, old man. We will sit back, let nature take its course, and inherit the kingdom anyway." Theodore did not flinch. He slowly set his coffee mug down on the side table, the ceramic clinking softly against the wood. He looked at David with an expression of profound, almost pitying amusement. It was the look of a grand master watching a novice declare checkmate while their own king was surrounded. Valerie Knox smiled. It was a terrifying, shark-like expression that sent a chill straight down my spine. She reached back into her leather briefcase, her fingers curling around the thickest document yet. David had just confidently laid his final card on the table, unaware that the deck had been rigged from the very start. "How do you think David will react when he learns about the true value of the estate?" David stood near the edge of the dining table, his chest rising and falling as he clung to his final shred of leverage. The paralyzing dread that had washed over him moments earlier began to recede, replaced by a cold, calculating stubbornness. He had spent his entire career in middle management, constantly passed over for executive promotions because he lacked genuine vision. His entire sense of self-worth was tied to projecting an image of unearned wealth, and he was not going to let a single legal maneuver strip away his anticipated fortune. He adjusted the collar of his wrinkled linen shirt, lifting his chin in a desperate display of renewed defiance. "You can freeze the current accounts," David sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You can revoke my authority today, but you are ignoring the most glaring reality in this room." He pointed a rigid finger at my grandfather, who was sitting quietly in the worn fabric recliner. "He is 82 years old. He just suffered a severe respiratory failure. His days are numbered, and we all know it." Pamela wiped a streak of ruined makeup from her cheek, her posture straightening as she caught on to her husband's cruel logic. She had grown up accustomed to Theodore providing everything, never learning the value of a hard-earned dollar. She assumed her inheritance was an unshakable birthright. "We just have to wait you out," Pamela added, a spiteful edge returning to her tone. "You cannot rewrite history, Valerie. My father drafted his last will and testament over a decade ago. I am the sole designated heir to his estate." David placed his hands flat on the oak table, leaning forward to project dominance. "The second his heart stops ticking, that original will goes into probate," David declared. "The Tampa house, the remaining investment portfolios, the pension residuals, they all default to my wife. You may have won the afternoon, but we own the endgame. We will inherit the kingdom anyway." The living room fell silent, save for the faint, rhythmic hum of the central air conditioning unit. David wore a triumphant smirk, entirely convinced he had just backed the high-powered attorney into an inescapable corner. Valerie Knox did not flinch. She did not argue. Instead, the corners of her mouth curled upward into a slow, terrifying, shark-like smile. It was the expression of an apex predator watching its prey step willingly into a lethal trap. She unclasped the secondary compartment of her battered leather briefcase. The crisp rustle of thick, high-quality legal paper filled the tense space. "Your reliance on a decade-old document is remarkably naive, David," Valerie stated softly. "In the state of Florida, a legally competent individual retains the unalienable right to update, modify, or entirely replace their estate planning directives at any given moment." She withdrew a pristine, heavy parchment document bound by a dark blue spine. She held it up, letting the afternoon light catch the raised notary seal stamped into the bottom corner. "This is Theodore's new last will and testament," Valerie announced. "Drafted, witnessed, and fully executed as of late last night. Your previous status as the sole heir has been officially extinguished." The triumphant smirk vanished from my father's sunburned face. He blinked rapidly, his eyes darting from the sealed document to my grandfather's calm, unreadable expression. "No," David stammered, taking a hesitant step backward. "That is impossible. You cannot draft a valid will in the middle of the night." "I assure you it is fully binding," Valerie replied, her voice slicing through his denial like a surgical blade. Let us review the updated distribution of assets, shall we? Valerie opened the blue cover, her eyes scanning the neatly typed paragraphs. Pursuant to the directives outlined in Section 2, the primary residence located here in Tampa, along with all associated furnishings and personal property, is bequeathed in its entirety to his granddaughter, Renee Henderson. Pamela let out a sharp, breathless gasp. The house she had been planning to list with a real estate broker on Monday morning was no longer hers to sell. Furthermore, Valerie continued, turning to the next page, all liquid assets, including the remaining balances of the primary checking, savings, and retirement accounts, are hereby transferred exclusively to Renee Henderson. Courtney let out a strangled whimper. The endless supply of funds that financed her luxury downtown loft, her designer handbags, and her leased European sedan was permanently severed. Her fake influencer lifestyle was dead. David clenched his jaw, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "Fine," he spat, his voice trembling with unrestrained fury. "Keep the house. Keep the leftover scraps in the retirement fund. The medical bills and property taxes will eat up most of that anyway. It is a hollow victory." Valerie paused. She closed the blue cover and set the document down on the polished oak table. She looked at David with a gaze so piercing it seemed to lower the temperature in the room. "You truly believe you had a comprehensive understanding of this estate?" she murmured. "You monitored his daily expenses, you managed the decoy checking account, and you assumed you were looking at the entire financial picture." David frowned, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his features. "What are you talking about?" Valerie reached into her briefcase one final time. She pulled out a separate, waterproof envelope. "Theodore was a highly successful international freight logistics manager, David. Did you honestly think a man who spent 40 years negotiating global trade routes would leave his entire life savings sitting in a standard low-yield checking account?" She opened the waterproof envelope and extracted a dense stack of corporate formation documents. "I am now reading from the directives regarding the blind trust," Valerie announced. "The trust holds sole ownership of a limited liability company formed 10 years ago." David shook his head, his brow furrowing in deep bewilderment. "What limited liability company? I have never seen any tax documents for an LLC." "That is because Theodore shielded it behind layers of corporate privacy that your generic power of attorney could never pierce," Valerie explained, holding up the commercial property deed. "The LLC holds the title to a premium parcel of commercial real estate located in the heart of downtown Orlando. It features a 3-story office plaza currently occupied by a rapidly expanding tech firm on a 10-year triple-net corporate lease." The color drained entirely from my mother's face. She grabbed the edge of the kitchen island to steady herself, her knuckles turning bone white. Valerie extracted a single sheet of paper from the back of the envelope. It was the most recent certified property appraisal. She placed her fingertips on the edge of the paper and slid it across the smooth oak table. It glided silently, stopping mere inches from my father's hands. "Read the valuation, David," she commanded. David looked down, his eyes locked onto the bold black numbers printed at the bottom of the page. His breath hitched in his throat. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The staggering reality of the fortune he had lived next to, the fortune he had never known existed, struck him with the force of a physical blow. $4.2 million, Valerie stated, saying the number out loud to ensure every person in the room heard it clearly, generating a staggering, uninterrupted monthly lease income. And pursuant to the new last will and testament, 100% of that commercial asset, the LLC, and the blind trust are left exclusively to Renee Henderson. The physical toll of the revelation was instantaneous. Pamela's knees buckled beneath her. She collapsed onto the ceramic tile floor, her resort dress pooling around her legs as she let out a hollow, devastated sob. Courtney dropped her oversized designer sunglasses. They clattered against the floorboards as she buried her face in her hands, bursting into loud, hysterical tears. The crushing weight of their newly acquired poverty broke them in seconds. David stood frozen, staring at the appraisal document as if it were written in an alien language. He had traded his dignity, his morality, and his family for a decoy account, while unimaginable wealth sat safely out of his reach. Theodore slowly pushed himself up from his worn fabric recliner. He leaned on his wooden cane, standing tall and resolute in the center of his living room. He looked down at my mother, sobbing on the floor, then turned his piercing blue eyes toward my father. "You managed the decoy, David," Theodore said, his voice carrying the quiet, devastating weight of absolute finality. "You failed the test." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Courtney's frantic weeping. They were left with zero. No house, no accounts, no commercial empire, only the luggage they had dragged through the front door. But a cornered predator is the most dangerous kind. The initial shock began to wear off, replaced by a desperate, frantic survival instinct. David tore his gaze away from the appraisal document. His eyes locked onto me, burning with a volatile, unhinged fury. He pointed a trembling finger at my chest, his chest heaving as he prepared to launch his final, desperate counterattack. "You manipulated him," David screamed, his voice cracking under the strain of his own desperation. "You waited until we were out of the state. You isolated a vulnerable old man, and you coerced him into signing these fraudulent papers. I will drag you into probate court. I will sue you for undue influence. I will spend every dime I can borrow to prove you orchestrated this entire scheme." The threat hung in the air, a final, vicious attempt to regain control. David thought he could use the legal system to bully us into submission. He had no idea Valerie was about to deploy the ultimate weapon, a piece of evidence so damning it would force him to choose between walking away empty-handed or spending the next decade in a state penitentiary. The threat of a drawn-out probate battle hung in the humid living room air, sharp and desperate. David leaned heavily against the oak dining table, his chest heaving, his expensive linen shirt now stained with dark patches of sweat. He painted a terrifying picture of legal warfare, vowing to hire ruthless litigators to depose me, to freeze the assets pending a judge's review, and to drag my name through the mud for coercing a fragile elder. He believed his bluster could force a settlement, hoping I would trade a portion of the fortune just to make the nightmare stop. Valerie Knox did not interrupt his frantic tirade. She allowed him to exhaust his remaining oxygen, watching him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a trapped insect. When David finally paused to draw a ragged breath, Valerie reached out and opened her sleek silver laptop. The hinges moved with a quiet, expensive resistance. She tapped a few keys, her eyes fixed on the glowing screen. "Your threat of a probate lawsuit hinges entirely on proving undue influence," Valerie stated, her voice dropping into a conversational, almost instructional tone. "You intend to argue that Renee isolated a confused, vulnerable man and forced him to sign away his estate. It is a common strategy in elder law. And it is precisely why we prepared an insurmountable defense." She turned the laptop around, facing the screen toward the center of the room. She pressed the spacebar. Theodore's digital image filled the display. The lighting was stark and clear. He sat straight-backed, his gaze locked directly into the camera lens. He did not look confused. He did not look vulnerable. He looked like a patriarch delivering a binding edict. "My name is Theodore," the recorded voice rang out, the audio crisp and commanding through the laptop speakers. "I am recording this statement of my own free will, free from any outside influence or duress." Pamela let out a soft, wounded whimper, pressing her hands over her mouth. Hearing her father speak with such cold clarity stripped away the comforting illusion she had built for herself. "I am speaking directly to any judge or legal authority reviewing my estate in the future," the digital Theodore continued. "My son-in-law David and my daughter Pamela have spent the last 2 years systematically poisoning me with unauthorized sedatives. They manufactured a false narrative of cognitive decline to steal my wealth and plot my institutionalization." David took a staggering step backward. His sunburned face turned a chalky, sickly white. The video deposition was a stake driven straight through the heart of his undue influence argument. "My granddaughter Courtney eagerly participated in this theft, financing a fraudulent influencer lifestyle using my stolen retirement funds," the recording played on, unyielding. "I leave them nothing. I explicitly disinherit David, Pamela, and Courtney. They have shown zero compassion and profound cruelty toward me. I am leaving the entirety of my estate to my granddaughter Renee. Any attempt by David to contest this will is a direct continuation of his financial exploitation and abuse." Valerie pressed a button, freezing the video on Theodore's stern, unflinching expression. She closed the laptop with a definitive snap. "You coached him," David stammered, his voice thin and reedy. He pointed a shaking finger at the closed computer. "That recording means nothing. You fed him a script. I will bring in my own experts. I will subpoena his medical records. I will prove he was not in his right mind when he made that video." Valerie leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table. "You want to subpoena his medical records, David? That is a fascinating request, because I happen to have the most recent one right here." She reached into her battered leather briefcase one final time. She extracted the official Tampa General Hospital toxicology report, the same document printed on heavy hospital letterhead. She did not slide this paper across the table. She held it up, forcing David to look at the bold black text, the chemical compounds listed in undeniable scientific detail. "3 days ago, your father-in-law suffered severe respiratory failure," Valerie explained, her tone devoid of any mercy. "The emergency room physicians ran a full blood panel. This report details a lethal saturation of prescription tranquilizers in his system, a medication you procured, a medication you administered without a valid prescription or medical license." Pamela let out a strangled gasp, her eyes darting frantically toward the front door. The reality of her actions was shifting from a convenient family secret to a documented clinical fact. "The attending physician flagged his chart for chemical abuse," Valerie continued, lowering the paper. "He provided a sworn statement that the prior dementia diagnosis was an engineered fraud. The hospital logged the incident. The evidence is secured." David opened his mouth, but his vocal cords failed him. His hands trembled so fiercely he had to grip the back of a dining chair to remain standing. Valerie stood up to her full height, smoothing the front of her navy pinstripe suit. She delivered the final, crushing blow. "If you file a single motion in probate court, David, if you so much as hire a lawyer to draft a letter contesting this estate, I will immediately forward this binder to the Florida State Attorney. I will hand them the offshore wire logs proving your attempted theft. I will hand them the credit card statements detailing Courtney's stolen luxury purchases, and I will hand them this toxicology report proving you systematically poisoned an elderly man for financial gain." The living room fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. "The state attorney will not view this as a family dispute," Valerie warned, her eyes narrowing into cold, dark slits. "They will pursue felony charges for elder financial exploitation and aggravated elder abuse. Those are severe criminal offenses in this state. You will not face a civil judge. You will face a criminal jury. You will trade your linen shirts for an orange jumpsuit, and you will spend the next 10 to 15 years in a state penitentiary." The trap had snapped entirely shut. The steel jaws locked around their ankles, leaving them zero room to maneuver, zero room to negotiate, and zero room to breathe. Valerie picked up her leather briefcase. "You have a choice to make right now," she commanded. "You can walk out that front door in silence, forfeit your imagined inheritance, and never speak to my client again. Or you can fight this will, and I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your natural life behind bars. Choose." David stared at the lawyer, his chest heaving. He looked at the closed laptop, then at the toxicology report, then at the imposing figure of my grandfather sitting quietly in his worn fabric recliner. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a hollow, paralyzing terror. He knew Valerie was not bluffing. He knew the evidence was insurmountable. He swallowed hard, his throat dry and tight. He slowly released his grip on the wooden dining chair. He did not say a word to me. He did not say a word to Theodore. He simply turned around, his shoulders slumped in utter, devastating defeat. Pamela, however, needed a target for her overwhelming panic. Her luxurious vacation had transformed into a looming prison sentence in less than 30 minutes. She spun around, her eyes landing on Courtney. The youngest daughter was still huddled near the entryway, mascara running down her cheeks, weeping over her lost designer lifestyle. "Grab your bags," Pamela hissed, her voice dripping with venomous spite. She marched toward the foyer, her resort dress swishing forcefully around her ankles. "Do not just stand there crying like a useless child. Grab the luggage." Courtney flinched, shrinking back against the wall. "Mom, my credit cards," she sobbed, her voice high and desperate. "How am I supposed to pay my rent? How am I supposed to live?" "You are going to have to find a real job," Pamela snapped. grabbing the handle of her heavy hard-shell suitcase and yanking it harshly across the ceramic tile. Because thanks to your incessant need to post our entire lives on the internet, we have nothing left. You handed them the rope they used to hang us. David brushed past his weeping daughter without a single glance of sympathy. He grabbed his own oversized canvas tote, hauling it over his shoulder. The pristine, united front they had maintained for 3 decades fractured into bitter resentment. The toxic ecosystem they had built to isolate and exploit Theodore had finally collapsed inward, crushing them under the weight of their own greed. They dragged their luxury luggage out the front door, the plastic wheels grinding loudly against the concrete walkway. The sounds of their bitter bickering drifted through the humid afternoon air, growing fainter as they reached the driveway. Courtney lugged her heavy bags, her wedge sandals scraping awkwardly, no longer concerned with protecting the leather trim. I stood in the center of the living room, listening to the heavy thud of the car doors slamming shut. The pristine black sport utility vehicle fired up its engine, the tires squealing softly as they backed out of the driveway and sped away down the quiet suburban street. The front door clicked shut, the brass deadbolt sliding into place with a solid, definitive snap. The house was suddenly quiet. The suffocating tension that had gripped the air since I found that yellow sticky note finally began to dissipate, replaced by the low, steady hum of the air conditioning unit. I looked at Valerie, who was quietly packing the remaining documents back into her briefcase. I looked at Theodore, who was resting his head against the back of his recliner, a profound sense of peace settling over his weathered features. The storm had passed, and the wreckage they left behind was the foundation we would use to rebuild. The heavy wooden front door remained shut. The brass deadbolt stayed locked. For the first time in my 32 years of existence, the silence inside a room shared with my family did not feel like a loaded weapon waiting to discharge. It felt like a deep, cleansing breath. Valerie packed her files into her leather briefcase, offering a curt professional nod before exiting through the garage to give us privacy. The moment her sedan pulled away, the house transformed. The suffocating atmosphere of engineered sickness evaporated. We spent the next several days establishing a new baseline. My first official act as Theodore's healthcare surrogate involved picking up the phone and hiring the best in-home physical therapist the Tampa Bay area had to offer. The initial revenue distribution from the Orlando commercial lease provided more than enough capital to secure elite medical care. Dr. Mitchell arrived every Tuesday and Thursday morning. He brought resistance bands, balance boards, and a rigorous regimen designed to rebuild the muscle atrophy caused by 2 years of forced lethargy. Theodore attacked his physical rehabilitation with the same ruthless determination he once applied to international freight logistics. He was a man who had built a shipping empire from a single warehouse, intimately familiar with the concept of sweat equity. He refused to let the ghost of those chemical sedatives dictate his mobility. I watched him push through the grueling exercises, his jaw set, a sheen of perspiration forming on his brow. Within 3 weeks, the wooden cane he had leaned on so heavily was relegated to the back of the coat closet. His stride lengthened, his balance returned. The vibrant, sharp-witted patriarch was fully restored to his former strength. As his physical health flourished, my professional life reached a critical crossroads. I had spent the last 5 years grinding through 60-hour weeks at a mid-level corporate marketing agency. My days were consumed by endless video conferences, demanding clients, and a micromanaging boss who viewed my dedication as a resource to be endlessly mined. For years, I tolerated the burnout because I craved the financial stability my parents always mocked me for lacking. The revenue from the blind trust changed the entire equation. I no longer needed to trade my sanity for a paycheck. I drafted my resignation email on a Tuesday afternoon, keeping the text concise and professional. Hitting the send button delivered a rush of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I was finally betting on myself. I decided to launch my own digital marketing consultancy, catering to a select handful of premium clients. To create my new headquarters, we had to purge the last lingering remnants of my father from the property. Theodore and I spent an entire weekend stripping David's former home office. We bagged up his golf magazines, his pretentious corporate awards, and the heavy drapery that trapped the smell of his musky cologne. We hauled everything to the curb. I painted the walls a bright, crisp white, letting the harsh Florida sunlight pour through the uncovered windows. I set up a sleek standing desk, ergonomic ergonomic monitors, and a thriving potted ficus in the corner. The space no longer belonged to a man hiding his failures. It belonged to a woman building her future. Our daily routine settled into a comfortable, rewarding rhythm. We were no longer a patient and a caregiver trapped in a toxic dynamic. We were partners operating on a foundation of mutual respect. Sunday dinners became a sacred tradition. Instead of heating up flavorless, pureed meals, we cooked together. The kitchen filled with the rich aromas of roasting garlic, seared steak, and fresh rosemary. Theodore chopped vegetables with precise, practiced hands, recounting stories of his travels to port cities across the globe. Laughter, genuine and unrestrained, bounced off the walls, replacing the bitter tension that used to choke the household. After dinner, Theodore would clear the dishes and retrieve a vintage hand-carved wooden chess set from the hall cabinet. The pieces were heavy, crafted from dark mahogany and pale birch. We spent hours sitting across from each other at the dining table, the same table where Valerie had dismantled my parents just weeks prior. Theodore taught me the intricate strategies of the board, demonstrating how to sacrifice a pawn to expose an enemy king. "You always control the center of the board, Renee," he advised, sliding a knight into a dominant position. "Force your opponent to react to your movements, never the other way around." His lessons extended far beyond the checkered squares. He was teaching me how to navigate a world that had always tried to push me into the margins. I realized the true value of the inheritance he had given me. It was not just the $4.2 million commercial property or the monthly lease income. He had handed me the ultimate currency, freedom. For my entire life, I had accepted the role of the overlooked servant. I was the reliable workhorse expected to absorb the stress, fix the problems, and quietly disappear, while Courtney received the applause. My parents had trained me to believe my worth was tied exclusively to my utility. Watching them drag their luggage down the driveway was not a tragic loss. It was a surgical extraction of a deep, festering wound. I had saved my grandfather from a bleak state-run ward, but in the process, I had saved myself from a lifetime of subjugation. The financial reality of our victory cemented itself on the first day of the new month. I opened my laptop and logged into the newly established trust portal. The corporate tenant in Orlando had wired their monthly triple net lease payment. The numbers glowing on the screen were staggering, representing more capital than my father had earned in a year. The funds secured Theodore's premium healthcare, covered the property taxes David had neglected, and provided a formidable safety net for my new business venture. We were untouchable. Or so I thought. The quiet sanctuary we had built over the past 6 weeks was destined to be disrupted. You cannot execute a financial and legal decapitation of that magnitude without creating shockwaves in the broader social ecosystem. The extended family network, the country club acquaintances, and David's professional circle were bound to notice the sudden, catastrophic shift in their lifestyle. It happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I was reviewing a client analytics report in my new pristine office when my cell phone buzzed against the desk surface. The screen displayed an unknown caller ID. I normally sent unfamiliar numbers straight to voicemail, but an odd instinct urged me to answer. I tapped the green icon and lifted the device to my ear. A frantic, weeping voice echoed through the speaker, carrying a tone of such profound desperation it made my blood run cold. The toxic trio had hit rock bottom, and the fallout was about to drag the ugly truth into the unforgiving light of day. The frantic, weeping voice pouring through the speaker of my cell phone did not belong to my mother. It was Aunt Martha, my father's older sister. Martha lived in a wealthy, gated enclave in Naples, spending her days organizing charity luncheons and collecting elite suburban gossip. She rarely called me. Our entire relationship consisted of polite, rigid nods at formal Thanksgiving dinners. But today, her polished exterior was fractured. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, her words tumbling out in a rushed, terrified whisper. "Renee, please tell me the rumors are false," Martha pleaded, the sound of her pacing echoing over the line. "Please tell me your father is not facing a federal inquiry." I stood up from my pristine standing desk, walking over to the window to look out at the sunlit Tampa street. Valerie Knox had honored her attorney-client privilege. She had not leaked a single document to the press or the public. But in the insular, hyper-connected circles of Florida high society, sudden banking freezes and halted offshore wire transfers generated an undeniable paper trail. The financial compliance officers talked, the country club board members whispered. The truth had breached the dam. I maintained a calm, neutral tone. "What exactly are people saying, Martha?" She let out a shaky breath, spilling the catastrophic details of my parents' sudden downfall. The destruction had started with David's career. The federal banking algorithms that flagged his attempted wire transfer from Maui did not just freeze his personal checking accounts. They generated an automatic suspicious activity report that was routed directly to the senior partners at his investment firm. You cannot work in high-level wealth management with a pending investigation for elder financial exploitation hanging over your head. Martha described the scene with vivid, horrified clarity. The firm executives summoned David into a glass-walled conference room on a Tuesday morning. They did not allow him to return to his desk. Security personnel escorted him through the bustling lobby, carrying his personal belongings in a single cardboard box. To avoid a public relations nightmare, the firm forced him to sign a non-disclosure agreement and resign immediately. They stripped his corporate benefits and severely penalized his unvested pension. The man who had prided himself on projecting ultimate financial dominance was unceremoniously shoved into an early, underfunded retirement, his professional reputation burned to ash. The social ruin followed right on the heels of the professional collapse. Pamela had spent decades cultivating a network of wealthy socialite friends, hosting extravagant tennis tournaments and catered brunches. She believed her status was bulletproof. 2 days after David lost his job, Pamela attempted to attend the annual country club charity gala, acting as though nothing was wrong. Martha detailed the crushing humiliation my mother endured. The club president, a woman Pamela had considered a close confidant, intercepted her in the opulent foyer. The president quietly but firmly asked her to hand over her membership card and leave the premises, citing unpaid dues and the toxic scandal surrounding their family name. When Pamela tried to call her friends for support, her calls went straight to voicemail. The elite social circle she worshipped treated financial ruin like a highly contagious disease. They cut her off without a second thought, leaving her entirely isolated. The rapid evaporation of their income created an immediate housing crisis. Because the bank froze their primary accounts and the incoming trust revenue had vanished, my parents could not sustain the exorbitant mortgage on their sprawling suburban estate. Martha informed me they had quietly listed the property in a desperate short sale to avoid a public foreclosure. "They are moving today," Martha whispered, her voice tinged with a mixture of pity and revulsion. "I drove past their house this morning. They could not even afford a professional moving company." David was sweating in the humidity, hauling cheap cardboard boxes into a rented truck. "They are relocating to a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a rundown complex right next to the interstate highway." The toxic ecosystem they had built was imploding, turning the three of them against each other in a brutal war for survival. Martha recounted the screaming matches that echoed through their neighborhood during the packing process. David blamed Pamela for hiring a cut-rate staging agent that tipped off Valerie Knox. Pamela blamed David for leaving a digital trail on the offshore wire transfers. The most visceral detail involved my sister Courtney. In the middle of the night, a tow truck arrived at the house to repossess her leased European sedan. Courtney stood on the curb in her pajamas, screaming at the repo agent, while David and Pamela watched from the front window, refusing to intervene. They were now trapped together in a tiny, suffocating apartment, stripped of their stolen wealth, living in a personal hell of their own making. I thanked Martha for the update, offering no sympathy and no apologies. I pressed the red icon to end the call, sliding the phone back onto my desk. I looked around my bright, spacious home office, breathing in the scent of the blooming hibiscus plants near the open window. I felt a profound sense of closure. The universe had delivered the exact harvest they had planted. 2 days later, the real desperation surfaced. I was sitting on the lanai with Theodore, enjoying the cool evening breeze sweeping in from Tampa Bay. We were drinking iced tea, the clinking of ice cubes the only sound in the peaceful dusk. My phone chimed, signaling a new notification in my filtered messages folder. I had blocked my parents' numbers weeks ago, but the operating system still diverted their voicemails into a hidden archive. Curiosity got the better of me. I tapped the screen and pressed the play icon. The audio was rough, filled with static and heavy, ragged breathing. It was Pamela. Her voice lacked the sharp, condescending edge that had defined my entire childhood. She sounded hollow, defeated, and terrified. The pristine facade had cracked wide open, revealing the raw panic underneath. "Renee, please pick up," Pamela begged, her words rushing together in a frantic stream. "You have to help us. We are drowning. David tried to launch a new consulting venture, but no one will sign with him. He borrowed money from some very aggressive private lenders to cover our legal retaining fees, and now they are demanding repayment. They are threatening to take everything we have left." I listened to a loud metallic crash in the background of the recording, followed by the muffled sound of David shouting a string of profanities. Pamela let out a sharp sob, covering the microphone for a brief second before returning. "We are living out of boxes, Renee. Courtney will not stop crying. The air conditioning in this awful apartment is broken, and we cannot afford to fix it. Please, I know you have the revenue from the Orlando property. I know you control the trust. Just loan us $50,000. We will pay you back, I swear. You cannot just abandon your own blood. You are my daughter, please." The recording ended with a pathetic, lingering whimper before the automated system cut the connection. I sat still in the warm Florida breeze, the digital display glowing in the dimming light. 10 years ago, this recording would have broken my heart. The old version of me, the overlooked servant desperate for a scrap of parental affection, would have drained my own meager savings to rescue them. I would have rationalized their abuse, convincing myself that stepping up to save the family was my inherent duty. But Theodore had taught me better. He had taught me the difference between a family and a parasite. A family protects you when you are vulnerable. A parasite drains your resources and discards the empty shell. I looked across the patio table at my grandfather. He was watching the sunset, his posture relaxed, a healthy flush of color in his cheeks. He had survived their chemical prison. I had survived their emotional subjugation. I felt no guilt. I felt zero obligation. The tears on that voicemail were not born from remorse or self-reflection. They were born from the agonizing realization that they could no longer use me as a shield against the consequences of their own actions. I dragged my index finger across the glass screen, highlighting the audio file. I tapped the red trash bin icon. A prompt appeared asking if I wanted to permanently delete the message. I tapped confirm. The voicemail vanished, erased from the server and permanently excised from my life. I slid the phone into my pocket and took a long, refreshing sip of sweet tea. The poison was fully extracted. We needed to focus our energy on the future. The following morning, Theodore had a routine medical checkup scheduled at a specialty clinic downtown. It was meant to be a simple, celebratory trip to confirm the continued success of his physical rehabilitation. The grueling physical therapy sessions had worked wonders, and this appointment was the final milestone in his recovery journey. I had no idea our planned route to the medical plaza would force us to cross paths with the most spectacular, breathtaking display of poetic justice I could ever imagine. The final chapter of their downfall was waiting for us just down the highway, ready to deliver a conclusion that would leave me utterly astonished. 6 months had passed since the afternoon the heavy wooden front door clicked shut, locking my former family out of our lives forever. It was late June, and the oppressive Florida heat had settled over the Tampa Peninsula like a thick, damp blanket. I steered my newly purchased hybrid sedan down the sun-baked asphalt of Interstate 275. The quiet, reliable vehicle was funded by the first quarter profits of my thriving digital marketing agency. Theodore sat in the passenger seat, wearing a crisp linen button-down shirt and a pair of classic aviator sunglasses. He held a thermal travel mug of dark roast coffee, tapping his fingers in time with the classic jazz station playing softly through the speakers. We were headed toward the downtown medical plaza for his final rehabilitation discharge appointment. Dr. Mitchell had signed off on his rigorous physical therapy regimen 2 weeks prior. Today was merely a formality to confirm his cardiovascular endurance had returned to its peak baseline. Theodore looked vibrant, sharp, and undeniably alive. The frail, chemical-induced ghost that used to slump in the living room recliner was a distant memory. A severe traffic collision near the Hillsborough River Bridge forced the navigation system to recalculate our route. The digital map directed me off the interstate and onto a crumbling, neglected stretch of county highway on the outskirts of town. We cruised past abandoned strip malls, overgrown citrus groves, and faded, peeling billboards. The vibrant energy of the city faded, replaced by a bleak, forgotten industrial landscape. Up ahead, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with rusted wire, stood a sprawling cinder-block compound. The exterior paint was a depressing shade of institution gray, flaking off in long, brittle strips. A sun-bleached sign near the cracked driveway read, "Sunset Pines Assisted Living Facility." A cold shudder ran down my spine, chilling the warm air inside the car cabin. This was the exact place my parents had eagerly planned to abandon my grandfather. Looking at the barred windows and the desolate, weed-choked courtyard, the sheer cruelty of their scheme materialized in stark reality. They were going to throw a brilliant, capable man into a concrete cage just to liquidate his real estate and fund their island vacations. I guided the sedan to a halt at a long, seemingly endless red traffic light directly across from the facility's loading dock. The service entrance was a grimy alleyway littered with overflowing industrial dumpsters. The stench of rotting food and antiseptic bleach drifted through the humid air, penetrating the sealed cabin of my car. As we waited for the light to turn green, a heavy metal utility door propped open. A young woman stepped out into the sweltering heat, dragging two immense, leaking black trash bags. She wore a shapeless, drab maroon uniform, the cheap polyester fabric stained with bleach spots and dark patches of sweat. Her hair, once a flawless cascade of expensive salon highlights, was pulled into a messy, frizzy knot, plastered to her forehead by the relentless humidity. She wore cheap rubber clogs, her feet shuffling awkwardly against the greasy pavement. She hoisted the first leaking garbage bag, struggling under the dead weight, and hurled it over the rim of the rusted dumpster. As she turned her head to wipe a streak of grime from her cheek, the harsh midday sun illuminated her features. My breath hitched in my throat. I squeezed the leather steering wheel, my knuckles turning white. It was Courtney. The girl who used to sip $400 cocktails in private Maui cabanas, the influencer who bragged to thousands of strangers about fake generational wealth, was now hauling medical waste in a state-run ward. Stripped of the stolen trust fund, cut off by her bankrupt parents, and possessing zero marketable skills, she had been forced to take the lowest-rung job she could find just to survive. The irony was so profound, it felt scripted by a higher power. My sister was now a receptionist and janitor at the very institution she had tried to banish her grandfather to. Courtney wiped her brow with the back of a gloved hand, her gaze drifting lazily toward the street. Her eyes locked onto my hybrid sedan. She recognized the profile of the driver. She saw Theodore sitting in the passenger seat, looking healthy, formidable, and impeccably dressed. The color drained from her sunburned face, leaving her skin a sickly, ashen gray. The second heavy trash bag in her left hand slipped from her grasp, hitting the asphalt with a wet, sickening thud. Garbage spilled over her cheap rubber clogs, scattering across the greasy alleyway. She stood frozen in the stifling heat, staring at the prosperous life she had gleefully tried to destroy, a life she could never return to. Her shoulders slumped, the arrogant, entitled posture she had worn for 3 decades replaced by the crushing weight of her new, inescapable reality. I glanced over at my grandfather. He had lowered his aviator sunglasses, watching the scene unfold with clear, calculating blue eyes. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply looked at the granddaughter who had happily spent his retirement savings while helping to plan his demise. Theodore let out a quiet, measured sigh, a sound holding decades of closure. He reached out and pressed the electronic button on the door panel. The tinted passenger window rolled up smoothly, severing the visual connection and sealing us safely inside our own world. The traffic light turned green. I pressed the accelerator, leaving Courtney standing ankle-deep in trash, trapped in the bleak, desolate reality she had helped build for herself. That evening, the relentless Florida heat finally broke, giving way to a cool, refreshing maritime breeze. Theodore and I sat on the back lanai of the Tampa house. The sky over the bay was a breathtaking canvas of deep indigo, vibrant magenta, and spun gold. The water reflected the twilight, glowing like scattered diamonds across the horizon. A pair of herons glided gracefully over the shoreline, searching for their evening meal in the shallow tide. I rested my laptop on the patio table, finalizing a lucrative marketing contract for a new tech client. My digital agency was thriving beyond my wildest expectations. The income from the Orlando commercial property remained untouched in a high-yield investment account, securing our future for decades to come. Theodore sat in a comfortable wicker chair, reading a thick hardcover biography, a glass of sweet iced tea resting by his side. The silence between us was profound. It was not the tense, suffocating quiet of a hostage situation. It was the sound of safety. For 32 years, I had believed that familial love was a transactional debt. I thought I had to earn my place at the table by shrinking myself, by absorbing their insults, and by carrying their burdens. I assumed that standing up for my own dignity would make me a villain. But staring out at the sunset painting the Tampa skyline, I finally understood the truth. Blood does not make a family. Actions do. Shared DNA is not a license for cruelty, and setting firm boundaries is never a betrayal. It is the ultimate foundation of self-respect. If someone expects you to sacrifice your peace, your dignity, or your sanity to maintain their comfort, they do not love you. They are simply using you as a shield against their own failures. You do not owe your loyalty to people who view your existence as a convenience. My parents and my sister thought they were leaving me behind to handle a tedious, broken burden while they flew off to paradise. They expected me to remain the quiet, obedient servant they had molded me to be. They assumed my silence was a symptom of weakness. Instead, they handed me the keys to my freedom, and I used those keys to lock them out of the kingdom forever. The American dream is often packaged in a very specific, highly polished, suburban aesthetic. We are sold the vision of manicured lawns, coordinated holiday portraits, and a sacred, unshakable loyalty to our bloodline. But standing on the lanai overlooking the dark expanse of Tampa Bay, watching the gold and indigo hues bleed into the evening tide, I recognize how easily that flawless facade can disguise a suffocating prison. My grandfather Theodore and I survived a silent, ruthless siege orchestrated by the very people designated by society to protect us. The wreckage my parents and sister left in their wake was not a sudden anomaly. It was the inevitable, bitter harvest of a generational rot, a toxic parenting philosophy that traded moral character for material comfort and genuine accountability for social appearances. Look closely at my sister Courtney. She was not born with a hardened, cruel heart. She was meticulously crafted into a predator by a mother and father who equated affection with endless, unearned excess. Within modern American culture, a dangerous trend has taken root. We often confuse providing for our children with shielding them from reality. David and Pamela handed my younger sister the world on a silver platter, entirely bypassing the essential, foundational lessons of fairness and emotional awareness. They funded her luxury downtown lofts, her leased European sedans, and her designer wardrobe, teaching her that status was an inherent birthright and that consequences were meant for other, lesser people. By removing every obstacle from her path, my parents amputated her empathy. When you raise a child to believe the universe owes them a limitless bounty, you do not create a successful independent adult. You forge a parasite. Courtney's tragic final act, shuffling in cheap rubber clogs, hauling medical waste at the exact grim facility she tried to condemn our grandfather to, was not a twist of cruel fate. It was the deferred, agonizing bill for a lifetime of parental negligence dressed up as privilege. On the opposite end of that psychological spectrum stood my own upbringing. If Courtney was raised to be the untouchable crown jewel, I was engineered from childhood to be the structural scaffolding. Traditional family structures often harbor a dark, unspoken dynamic that society rarely acknowledges in its pristine sitcoms and holiday advertisements. The responsible child is penalized with ever-increasing burdens, while the entitled child is rewarded with endless grace. Honesty in parenting requires acknowledging the distinct humanity, struggles, and emotional needs of each child. Yet I was treated merely as a logistical convenience. I was the reliable engine expected to run quietly in the background, absorbing the household stress, fixing the logistical nightmares, and fading into the shadows the moment it was time for the applause. My parents did not teach me resilience. They taught me that my value was conditional, tethered only to my usefulness. True family responsibility is not about demanding silent obedience or enforcing uncompensated caregiving. It is about nurturing integrity. Theodore understood this profound distinction. He stepped into the void my parents left behind and became the true moral compass of my life. He did not leave me the Orlando commercial property just because I flushed his forced chemical sedatives down the drain. He transferred that wealth because he recognized that I had spent 3 decades starving for the very fairness my parents had systematically denied me. He broke the cycle by finally shining a blinding, unforgiving light on the truth. Theodore demonstrated that guiding a child, even a 32-year-old adult navigating the complexities of modern life, sometimes means giving them the ultimate unspoken permission to stop playing the martyr. He taught me that you cannot heal a deep, festering wound while you are still handing the knife to the person cutting you. It takes a profound, earth-shattering event to fracture the deep-seated illusions we hold about our own bloodlines. If you are sitting there right now, watching a screen and recognizing the familiar, heavy shadows of your own upbringing in the quiet corners of this narrative, please know you are not alone. There is a vast, silent community of us who have had to redraw the maps of our lives and redefine what home actually means. I invite you to subscribe and follow Intimately Told Stories. We share these journeys because true healing begins the moment we realize our deepest, most isolating struggles are actually universal. Drop a comment below and tell us your story. The more we speak, the less power the silence holds over us. As the evening breeze sweeps through the hibiscus plants, rustling the green leaves against the window glass, I find myself looking out at the empty driveway where my parents' luxury vehicle used to sit. Society insists that blood is a binding contract, an unbreakable covenant demanding endless forgiveness, perpetual sacrifice, and unyielding compromise. We are bombarded with the narrative that cutting off your family is the ultimate moral failure, a selfish act that defies the natural order. But that is a comfortable, cowardly lie sold to keep victims securely locked inside burning houses. Here is the harsh truth they do not print in parenting manuals or Hallmark greeting cards. Unconditional love is a beautiful, necessary concept, but unconditional access to your life is a dangerous delusion. Sometimes, the most profound, deeply moral act of love you can offer your toxic family members is to step aside and let them fall apart. My parents and my sister are currently suffocating in a cramped, sweltering apartment, crushed beneath the overwhelming weight of their own exposed greed. I do not wish them physical harm, yet I will not lift a single finger to save them. True, long-term guidance is not rescuing people from the fires they intentionally started themselves. It is allowing the flames to burn away their illusions. We are conditioned to believe that a happy ending requires a tearful reconciliation around a crowded holiday table. But as I sit here in the quiet, breathing in the scent of salt air and hard-won freedom, I wonder if the most triumphant victory of all is simply realizing that the empty chairs in your home are not a tragedy. They are a rescue mission. Are you brave enough to stop watering dead branches, or will you let them drag you down into the soil?